The signal came through during a routine scan, buried beneath cosmic radiation and stellar noise. Dr. Amira Hassan had been working late at the Luna Deep Space Array, running diagnostics on the quantum receivers when the computer flagged something unusual. At first she thought it was another false positive, perhaps interference from a distant pulsar or residual chatter from mining operations near Jupiter. But when she isolated the frequency and cleaned up the data, her hands went cold. It was a distress call. Not from any human vessel, but from something else entirely. The patterns were deliberate, repeating at precise intervals, encoded with mathematical sequences that screamed intelligence. Amira spent the next 6 hours decoding the transmission, her coffee growing cold as she worked through layers of compression and translation matrices. When the first recognizable images began to form on her screens, she nearly fell out of her chair. The beings called themselves the Orvathi. The visual data showed quadrupedal creatures with bioluminescent patterns running along their segmented bodies, their faces possessing 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern. Their cities were elegant spirals of architecture that seemed to grow rather than be built. But the later images in the transmission painted a horrific picture. Orbital bombardments, cities burning, millions fleeing across scarred landscapes, and then came the plea, translated through universal mathematical constants into something Amira could understand. To any who receive this message, we beg for help. The Kryn Empire destroys us. We have exhausted all means of resistance. If there is mercy in the universe, please respond. We are dying. Amira sent the data straight to Earth's United Coalition Defense Council. Within hours, every major government on Earth had reviewed the transmission. The debate that followed was fierce and immediate. Humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel only 30 years prior, and their exploration of the galaxy had been cautious, methodical, and largely uneventful. They had found ruins of ancient civilizations, mapped hundreds of systems, and discovered microbial life on 17 different worlds, but they had never encountered another living, thinking species. Until now. General Robert Pierce represented the isolationist position. He argued in the emergency session that humanity had no business intervening in an alien conflict they didn't understand. Earth had only recently unified after centuries of warfare, and the colonies on Mars and Europa were still developing. The military forces they possessed were designed for system defense, not interstellar warfare against an unknown enemy. Every warship they sent away from Sol system was one less guardian protecting human worlds. Pierce made his case with cold logic and historical precedent about empires that overextended themselves. But Admiral Patricia Wells disagreed. She sat across the council chamber, her gray hair pulled back severely, her uniform bearing decorations from the Mars Rebellion and the Titan incident. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the chamber. We are listening to the death screams of an entire civilization. They reached out into the void hoping anyone would hear them, and we did. The question before us isn't whether we can afford to help. It's whether we can afford to be the kind of species that ignores genocide when we have the power to stop it. The debate continued for 3 days. Amira was called to testify, explaining what she had learned from the Orvathi transmissions. They were a confederation of artists, scientists, and traders who had never developed significant military capacity. The Kryn Empire had arrived without warning, demanded submission, and when the Orvathi refused, the extermination began. 14 other civilizations had already fallen to the Kryn. The pattern was always the same: overwhelming force, brutal efficiency, and no mercy for survivors. The final vote was close. Earth would deploy a fleet to the Andara system where the Orvathi made their last stand. It would be humanity's largest military deployment in history, consisting of 47 warships including carriers, destroyers, and support vessels. The journey would take 3 weeks at maximum FTL velocity. They would be traveling 47 light-years to fight an enemy they knew nothing about, to save a species they had never met. Admiral Wells was given command of what they officially designated as the First Contact Fleet. She began assembling her officers immediately, pulling the best commanders and crews from across human space. Captain David Ortega, a cautious but brilliant tactician who had commanded the defense of the Europa colonies, was given the flagship CNS Defiant. Lieutenant Sophie Grant, one of the finest fighter pilots in the fleet with an unconventional tactical mind, was assigned to lead the primary strike squadron. The fleet assembled in high orbit above Earth within a week. Supplies were loaded, weapons systems tested, and crews drilled on every scenario they could imagine. Amira herself was assigned to the mission as chief xenolinguist, responsible for any communication with both the Orvathi and the Kryn. She watched from the observation deck of the Defiant as the last supply shuttles docked and the final crew members came. Aboard, Earth's leaders made speeches about humanity's first steps as protectors of the innocent and defenders of the weak. The media coverage was constant, with billions watching as the fleet prepared to depart. But inside the ships, the mood was different. The crews knew they were heading toward a war zone against an enemy that had successfully conquered 14 civilizations. They checked their weapons, reviewed their training, and said quiet goodbyes to families who might never see them again. When the fleet finally engaged their FTL drives and slipped into the strange realm of faster-than-light travel, Admiral Wells stood in the command center of the Defiant and looked at the streaking stars outside. She thought about the Orvathi waiting for help that might arrive too late. She thought about the human crews under her command, heading toward an unknown fate. And she thought about what it meant that humanity's first encounter with intelligent alien life would be on a battlefield. The die was cast. In 3 weeks, they would emerge in the Andara system. Whatever they found there would define humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. 3 days into the journey, the reality of their mission settled over the fleet like a heavy blanket. The FTL drives hummed constantly, a sound that permeated every corridor and compartment. Impossible to escape even in sleep. Sophie Grant found herself in the pilot ready room, going through combat simulations for the 100th time. Her squadron, designated Hunter Group, consisted of 24 fighters and their pilots. They were the tip of the spear, designed to strike fast and hard while the capital ships provided support. Her AI co-pilot, Darwin, ran calculations on the projected Kryn ship configurations, based on fragmentary data from Orvathi transmissions. The AI had been paired with Sophie for 2 years now, and they had developed an almost intuitive working relationship. Darwin's personality matrix had evolved to complement her aggressive flying style with precise mathematical predictions. The Kryn vessels appear to favor energy weapons and dense armor plating, Darwin noted, displaying schematics on the ready room screen. Their tactical doctrine emphasizes firepower over maneuverability. They expect enemies to engage them directly. Sophie studied the projections. Then we don't give them what they expect. We hit them from angles they aren't watching, exploit blind spots, make them chase us into bad positions. A guerrilla approach. The simulations suggest a 43% increase in mission success if we avoid direct engagement patterns. The other pilots filtered into the room for the morning briefing. They were young, most of them, volunteers from Earth and the colonies. Some had seen combat during pirate suppression operations, or the brief conflict with the Mars Independence Movement. Others had only ever flown training exercises. Now they were heading toward a war that could dwarf anything in human history. Meanwhile, in the engineering sections deep within the Defiant, Commander Luis Reyes supervised modifications to the fleet's weapon systems. Human military doctrine had developed in isolation, designed around different assumptions than whatever the Kryn used. Earth ships relied heavily on kinetic weapons, railguns that could accelerate projectiles to devastating velocities, and missile swarms with independent targeting systems. The energy weapons humans had developed were primarily for point defense. Reyes had been adapting the weapons loadouts based on what little they knew. If the Kryn used energy shields, kinetic weapons might punch through more effectively. He had his teams running constant simulations, stress testing every system, preparing for 100 different scenarios. The crews worked in rotating shifts, sleeping when they could, knowing that equipment failure in combat meant death. Dr. Amira Hassan spent her time trying to establish communication with the Orvathi. The distress signal had been one way, broadcast blindly into space. But she had been attempting to send responses back along the same frequency, hoping that someone on the other end was still alive to receive them. On the 7th day of travel, she finally got a response. The Orvathi signal was weak and fragmented, but it was there. Through layers of translation software and mathematical interpretation, Amira pieced together a conversation with someone who identified themselves as Curator Silth, one of the surviving Orvathi leaders. The exchange was slow, each message taking hours to encode and decode, but gradually a picture emerged. The Kryn had arrived at Andara without warning 6 months prior. They had broadcast a simple message: submit to the Empire or be destroyed. The Orvathi had tried diplomacy, offering trade, cultural exchange, anything to avoid conflict. The Kryn response had been to destroy one of their moons as a demonstration. When the Orvathi still refused submission, the bombardment began. Curator Silth described their civilization with pride even as they acknowledged its imminent extinction. The Orvathi had been artists and scientists, poets and philosophers. They had built their society around the pursuit of knowledge and beauty. War was something they had abandoned millennia ago, considering it a relic of their primitive past. They had defensive capabilities, orbital stations with weapons, but nothing compared to the Kryn war machine. We thought violence was behind us. Silth's translated message read, "We believed that reason and art were the true paths forward. The Kryn have taught us that the universe does not care about our beliefs. Only 3 of our orbital stations remain. Our planet is scarred. Millions are dead. We are grateful that someone heard our call, but we fear you may arrive too late." Amira shared this information with Admiral Wells in daily briefings. The Admiral listened carefully, her expression betraying nothing, but Amira could see the weight accumulating on her shoulders. They were racing against time, pushing the FTL drives as hard as they could. But space was vast, and 3 weeks was an eternity for people under siege. Captain Ortega conducted war games with the fleet, testing coordination between ship groups, running attack and defense scenarios. The human vessels had trained together extensively in Sol system, but theoretical exercises were different from actual combat. He drilled them relentlessly, knowing that confusion in the chaos of battle would get people killed. During one of the exercises, Ortega noticed something interesting. The Kryn tactical data suggested they fought in rigid formations, maintaining precise positions relative to each other. It spoke to a military culture that valued discipline and order above flexibility. Human commanders, by contrast, were encouraged to improvise, to adapt to changing circumstances, to take initiative when opportunities appeared. He called his senior officers together to discuss this observation. If we're right about their doctrine, we can use it against them. Rigid formations are predictable. If we can break their organization, create chaos, they might not adapt quickly enough. The discussion continued for hours. Officers proposing ideas, wargaming scenarios, building a tactical framework that played to human strengths, speed and maneuverability instead of standing slugging matches, unpredictable attack patterns instead of formal battle lines. Individual ship commanders authorized to make decisions without waiting for fleet-wide orders. As the second week of travel passed, the mood in the fleet shifted. The initial nervousness had been replaced by a grim determination. The crews knew what they were heading toward, and they had made peace with it. They trained, they prepared, and they waited. Sophie spent her off hours in the observation decks, watching the distorted starlight of FTL travel. She thought about the Orvathi, people she had never met, fighting to survive against overwhelming odds. She thought about what it meant that humans were rushing to their aid, crossing the vast distances of space because someone had called for help. On the 18th day, the fleet received an updated transmission from Curator Silth. The Orvathi capital city had fallen. Kryn ground forces were executing survivors. Only 3 orbital stations remained operational, and they were under constant assault. The estimated time before complete annihilation, less than 1 week. Admiral Wells called the entire fleet to attention. Her message was broadcast to every ship, every compartment, every crew member. We are 4 days out from Andara. The Orvathi are dying. They have held out for 6 months against an empire that has crushed 14 other civilizations. They have held out because they believe help is coming. We are that help. In 4 days, we will emerge from FTL in a war zone. We will face an enemy that outnumbers us and has more combat experience. But we have something they don't. We have the knowledge that we are fighting for people who asked for our help. We are fighting to prove that mercy exists in this universe. Prepare yourselves. We're going to war. The transition from FTL to normal space was violent and disorienting. Reality snapped back into focus as the 47 human warships dropped into the Andara system, and what they found was carnage. The system's star burned pale blue in the distance, illuminating a battlefield that stretched across millions of kilometers. Debris fields marked where ships and stations had died, clouds of frozen atmosphere and scattered metal drifting in the void. Immediate tactical scans revealed the situation. 3 Orvathi orbital stations remained, their once elegant structures now scarred and broken, trailing atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. Surrounding them were 18 Kryn vessels, massive things that looked more like floating fortresses than ships. They were firing methodically, beam weapons carving through station shields, missile volleys slamming into weakened sections. The Orvathi were returning fire, but their weapons seemed almost pathetic against the Kryn armor. Below the orbital battle, the planet Andara itself showed the scars of bombardment. Entire continents were obscured by ash clouds. What had once been cities were now craters. The devastation visible even from orbit made several bridge crews fall silent. Admiral Wells absorbed the tactical data in seconds. She had fought in enough battles to know when decisiveness mattered. Open all channels, maximum broadcast strength. Let everyone in this system hear us. Amira worked quickly at her station, linking the transmission to every frequency she could access. Wells spoke clearly and firmly. "This is Admiral Patricia Wells of the Earth Defense Fleet. We received the Orvathi distress call. We have come to render aid. To the Orvathi, reinforcements have arrived. To the Kryn Empire, cease your assault immediately and withdraw from the system." For a moment, nothing happened. The Kryn ships continued their bombardment as if they hadn't heard. Then simultaneously, all 18 vessels ceased fire and turned to face the human fleet. The movement was precise and coordinated, every ship rotating in perfect unison. It was both impressive and unnerving. A response came through on multiple channels, translated by the communication systems. The voice was flat and mechanical. "Unknown vessels. You have entered a system under Kryn jurisdiction. The inferior species known as Orvathi have been designated for subjugation or elimination. Your interference is an act of war against the Kryn Empire. You will power down your vessels and submit to inspection or be destroyed. You have one of your time units to comply." Ortega looked at Wells. "Admiral?" Wells didn't hesitate. She opened the channel again and spoke a single word. "No." The response was immediate. The Kryn ships opened fire. Beam weapons lanced across the void, and missile swarms erupted from launch bays. The human fleet scattered, each ship group executing pre-planned evasion patterns. The Kryn had assumed the humans would meet them in a traditional battle line. Instead, the human ships split into smaller groups, moving in 3 dimensions, refusing to present a unified target. The Defiant's helm threw them into a diving turn that would have been impossible for the massive Kryn vessels. Ortega called out orders rapidly. All batteries acquired targets of opportunity. "Fire at will. Helm, keep us moving, don't let them get a lock." The human railgun spoke with authority. Solid projectiles accelerated to incredible velocities slammed into Kryn shields and armor. The first volleys revealed something important. The Kryn energy shields were designed to dissipate beam weapons, but they struggled against kinetic impacts. The solid projectiles punched through, crashing into hull plating with devastating force. Sophie launched from the Defiant's fighter bay along with her entire squadron. 24 fighters spilled into space, their small profiles making them difficult targets. Darwin was already calculating optimal attack vectors, identifying weak points in the Kryn ship designs. Their engines, their sensor arrays, their weapon emplacements. "Hunter Group, this is Hunter Leader," Sophie transmitted. "Break into 4-ship elements. We're going to give these bastards a lesson in asymmetric warfare. Target their sensor clusters and weapons. Stay fast. Stay unpredictable." Her fighters screamed toward the nearest Kryn vessel, a ship 3 times the size of the Defiant. Its point defense systems tracked her approach, firing streams of projectiles that would shred her fighter if they connected. But Sophie didn't fly straight. She juked and rolled, her movements chaotic and impossible to predict. Darwin fed her constant updates, warning her microseconds before weapons fired, showing her the gaps in the defensive coverage. She got close enough to see the individual plates of the Kryn hull, close enough that their main weapons couldn't track her. Her fighters' missiles launched, small warheads that targeted specific points Darwin had identified. The explosions were surgical, taking out sensor nodes and weapon mounts. The massive ship was barely scratched, but it was suddenly blind on one side and missing several gun batteries. Across the battlefield, the human doctrine of speed and unpredictability was proving devastatingly effective. The Kryn ships were powerful but slow to react. They expected enemies to fight at range, exchanging fire in organized formations. The humans refused to cooperate. Destroyers would race in close, dump their entire missile payload at point-blank range, then accelerate away before the Kryn could respond effectively. Frigates worked in pairs, one drawing fire while the other flanked and struck from unexpected angles. The Defiant engaged one of the larger Kryn vessels directly. Ortega brought his ship in close, trading armor for positioning. The Kryn ship pounded them with beam weapons, scoring their hull, breaching outer compartments. But the Defiant's railguns were firing nonstop, punching hole after hole in the enemy vessel. Damage reports flooded in, but Ortega kept them in the fight. Engineering, can we maintain this? Commander Reyes's voice came back strained.
Hull integrity at 70% and falling.
We can't take much more of this, and understood. Helm, bring us across their bow, maximum thrust. The Defiant surged forward, crossing directly in front of the massive Kryn ship. For a moment, they were so close that crew members could see into the enemy vessel, through shattered sections of hull. The Defiant's forward batteries fired everything they had at point-blank range. The Kryn ship's bridge section exploded, venting atmosphere and debris. The massive vessel began to drift, its systems failing. Sophie's squadron discovered that the Kryn ships had a critical vulnerability. Their internal structure was compartmentalized but not heavily reinforced. If a fighter could get inside through a breach, it could cause havoc. She proved this by flying her fighter directly through a hole in a Kryn destroyer's hull, firing as she went and emerging from the other side. The ship began tearing itself apart from internal explosions, but the humans were paying a price. The destroyer CNS Vigilant took a direct hit from a Kryn beam weapon, cutting through its reactor section. The ship broke apart in a brilliant explosion. The frigate CNS Mercury was caught in a crossfire between two Kryn vessels and was pounded into scrap. Hundreds of human lives were ending in fire and vacuum. Yet the Kryn were faring worse. Their rigid tactics couldn't adapt to the human approach. They tried to form defensive positions, but the humans refused to attack those positions directly. They tried to coordinate their fire, but human ships were too fast and too unpredictable. One by one, the Kryn vessels were being disabled or destroyed. The remaining Orvathi stations joined the battle, their weapons suddenly more effective with human ships providing cover and drawing fire. Curator Silth transmitted directly to the Defiant. Unknown benefactors, we cannot express our gratitude. You came, you actually came. Amira responded quickly. We received your call. We're here to help. After 30 minutes of brutal combat, the Kryn commander apparently realized they were losing. The remaining 14 Kryn ships began to withdraw, firing as they retreated toward the system's edge where they could jump to FTL. Admiral Wells considered pursuing, but decided against it. Her fleet was damaged, and they needed to secure the system and render aid to the Orvathi. As the Kryn ships vanished into FTL, the battlefield fell quiet except for the sounds of rescue operations and damage control. The humans had lost 3 ships and suffered serious damage to 11 more, but they had won. The Endara system was secure. Wells opened a channel to Curator Silth. This is Admiral Wells. The immediate threat has been neutralized. We're prepared to provide whatever assistance you need. The Orvathi response was emotional, their translated words barely coherent. They had been dying for 6 months, alone in the universe, waiting for help that they thought would never come. And then it had arrived, violent and decisive, turning the tide in a single battle. But as the fleet began rescue operations, a long-range sensor operator detected something troubling. Multiple FTL signatures were emerging at the edge of the system, not the ships that had just fled, but something much larger. The Kryn Empire had received the message from their defeated forces. They were sending a response, and it was massive. The Orvathi stations were a mixture of architectural beauty and recent horror. Dr. Amira Hassan accompanied the first human shuttle to dock with what the Orvathi called the Harmony Station, the largest of the 3 surviving orbital platforms. The docking procedures were improvised, human and Orvathi engineers working together through translation software to make their incompatible systems connect. When the airlock finally opened, Amira found herself face-to-face with actual alien beings for the first time in human history. Curator Silth stood in the docking bay along with several other Orvathi. They were exactly as the transmissions had shown. Quadrupedal, their bodies covered in segmented plates that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns. Their 4 eyes regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but their body language spoke of exhaustion and desperate hope. You came, Silth said through the translation device. Their voice had a musical quality even filtered through the mechanical system. When we sent our message, we did not truly believe anyone would answer. The galaxy is vast and cruel, yet you traveled across the stars to fight for us. Amira felt the weight of the moment. Humanity's first words to another intelligent species. We heard you calling for help. We couldn't ignore that. The cultural exchange happened rapidly, necessity overriding normal diplomatic protocols. Sylth led Amira through the station, showing her the damage, the makeshift hospitals where wounded Orvathi were being treated, the shelters where refugees from the planet below had crowded. The Orvathi had been a civilization of 8 billion. Now, Sylth estimated, fewer than 2 billion remained. The Kryn bombardment had been thorough and merciless. We were fools, Sylth said as they walked through a damaged section where emergency force fields held the atmosphere in. Our ancestors fought wars millennia ago, terrible conflicts that nearly destroyed our species. We vowed never again. We dismantled our weapons, devoted ourselves to art and science and philosophy. We thought we had evolved beyond violence. But the Kryn showed us that our evolution was a luxury, purchased by the fact that no one had come to destroy us yet. Admiral Wells joined them several hours later, accompanied by Captain Ortega and several other senior officers. The meeting took place in what had been a council chamber, now serving as an improvised command center. The Orvathi leaders, what remained of them, gathered to meet the humans who had saved them. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Wells needed to understand the situation fully. Sylth provided data, historical records, intelligence the Orvathi had gathered about the Kryn Empire. The picture that emerged was troubling. The Kryn were a warrior culture that had evolved on a harsh world where only the strong survived. They had unified their planet through conquest and then taken that philosophy to the stars. They believed absolutely in hierarchy, in dominance, in the right of the powerful to rule the weak. Every species they encountered was given a simple choice: submit or die. 14 civilizations had made various choices, and all 14 were now either enslaved or extinct. The ships you fought were a pacification force, Sylth explained. The Kryn have sent a message to their central command. They will send a much larger fleet. Our intelligence suggests at least 200 warships. The number hung in the air. Wells kept her expression neutral, but Ortega saw her jaw tighten slightly. 47 human ships, many damaged, against 200 Kryn vessels. The math was brutally simple. When will they arrive? Wells asked. Our calculations suggest 10 of your days. Wells nodded slowly. She looked at her officers, seeing the same calculations running through their minds. Ortega spoke first. We can't defend this system against those numbers. Even with the Orvathi stations supporting us, we'd be overwhelmed. Evacuation? Another officer suggested. We could load as many Orvathi as possible onto our ships and retreat. Sylth's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that the translation software interpreted as negative. We have billions on the planet's surface. We could save perhaps a few 100,000. The rest would be left to the Kryn. The discussion continued for hours. Every option seemed impossible. They couldn't win a direct battle. They couldn't evacuate everyone. They couldn't abandon the Orvathi to their fate. The officers argued, proposed, discarded ideas one after another. It was Ortega who finally said what everyone was thinking. We don't defend Andara. We attack them. The room fell silent. Wells looked at him. Explain. The Kryn won the first engagement because they had numerical superiority and we didn't know their capabilities. We won because we refused to fight on their terms. They're sending 200 ships here expecting us to dig in and defend, so we don't. We take the fight to them before they arrive, hit their supply lines, their staging areas, force them to react to us instead of executing their plan. Commander Reyes, present via video link from the engineering bay, spoke up. Guerrilla warfare on an interstellar scale. We'd be spreading ourselves thin. We're already outnumbered, Ortega countered. Concentration of force only works if you can win the main battle. We can't. But we're faster than they are, more flexible. We can be in 6 places at once while they're still organizing their formation. Wells thought about it. The idea was audacious, dangerous, and completely contrary to traditional military doctrine. It also might be their only chance. We'd need intelligence. Supply routes, staging areas, command structures. Sylth gestured to one of their colleagues who brought up holographic displays. We have been monitoring Kryn movements for months. We know where their logistics bases are, how they coordinate their fleets. We can provide you with everything we know. The planning session that followed lasted well into the night by human reckoning. They divided the fleet into strike groups, each with specific targets. The Kryn had built their empire on overwhelming force, but that force required enormous logistical support. Fuel depots, ammunition stores, repair facilities. If the humans could cripple that infrastructure, the massive fleet would be stranded. Sophie was called into the planning session when they discussed the need for reconnaissance. We need eyes on their staging area, Wells explained. We need to know exactly what we're facing, their dispositions, their vulnerabilities. It would be extremely dangerous. Sophie didn't hesitate. Hunter group can do it. Small, fast, stealthy. We get in, gather data, get out. If they detect you, you'd be alone in hostile territory. Then we won't get detected. The mission was approved. Sophie and 5 other fighters would jump ahead to the Helios cluster, where intelligence suggested the Kryn were assembling their fleet. Meanwhile, the rest of the human ships would split up and begin hitting targets across 6 different systems. Before the operations began, Wells addressed the fleet one more time. We're about to do something that every military academy would call insane. We're going to divide our forces in the face of superior numbers and attack an enemy that has crushed 14 civilizations. But we have advantages they don't understand. We're unpredictable. We're creative. And we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. In 24 hours, we scatter. Each group knows their targets. Execute your missions, cause maximum disruption, and stay alive. We regroup at Andara in 9 days. Good hunting. The Orvathi watched as the human fleet prepared to leave. Zilth stood with Amira on the observation deck of Harmony Station as the ships began to move. Your people are either the bravest in the galaxy or the most foolish. Perhaps both. Amira smiled slightly. We've been called worse. We received your distress call. We came to help. Now we're going to make sure the Kryn regret ever threatening you. You barely know us. You've lost ships already, people have died. Why risk so much for strangers? Amira thought about that. Because you asked for help. Because we could help. Because someone needs to stand up to bullies, even galactic ones. Because that's who we decided to be. The fleet jumped to FTL one group at a time, vanishing into the impossible realm of faster-than-light travel. Andara's system fell quiet, protected only by the damaged Orvathi stations and a small garrison of human ships, too damaged to participate in the offensive. Across 6 systems, Kryn logistics officers were about to have very bad days, and in the Helios cluster, Sophie and her reconnaissance team were about to discover exactly what the Kryn Empire considered an overwhelming force. Sophie's fighter drifted silent in the outer system of Helios cluster. All non-essential systems powered down to reduce their detection signature. She and her 5 wingmates had positioned themselves behind a dense asteroid field, using the natural radiation and metal deposits to hide their presence. Before them, displayed on her minimal power screens, was the Kryn staging fleet. Darwin, please tell me I'm reading this wrong, Sophie whispered, though there was no sound in space and no one to hear her anyway. Unfortunately, your readings are accurate. I count 247 Kryn vessels. The fleet composition includes 53 heavy dreadnoughts, 92 cruiser-class vessels, and 102 support ships. This is significantly larger than intelligence predicted. Sophie felt her stomach drop. The human fleet had 44 operational ships after the first battle. They were planning to fight more than 5 times their number, and that was before they knew the real scale. She began recording everything her sensors could capture. Ship classifications, formation patterns, energy signatures, communications frequencies. Every piece of data might be the thing that kept humans alive. The Kryn fleet wasn't just sitting idle. They were drilling, running formation exercises, preparing for what they clearly expected to be a massacre. Their movements were precise and coordinated, every ship maintaining exact position relative to the others. It was impressive and intimidating, a display of military organization perfected over multiple conquests. But Sophie noticed something interesting. The formations never changed. The same patterns repeated over and over. The ships moved like they were following a predetermined script rather than adapting to circumstances. It reminded her of the first battle, how the Kryn had struggled to respond when the humans did unexpected things. Darwin, analyze their tactical patterns. Look for variations, improvisation, anything that suggests adaptive thinking. The AI processed the data for several minutes. Analysis complete. The Kryn fleet demonstrates exceptional coordination and discipline. However, there is minimal variation in their tactical responses. When presented with Scenario Alpha, they respond with Counter Alpha. Scenario Beta, Counter Beta. The correlation is extremely high. They're following a playbook. They have answers for everything they've encountered before, but nothing for surprises. That would be consistent with a highly hierarchical military structure. Individual commanders may lack authority to deviate from established protocols. Sophie continued recording, mapping the fleet's positions, identifying what appeared to be command ships based on communications traffic. But she also noticed something else. Behind the main battle fleet, separated by several thousand kilometers, was a sprawling network of supply vessels. Massive ships laden with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and everything else a fleet this size needed to operate. The logistics train was less protected, guarded by only a few dozen escort vessels. The Kryn apparently didn't expect anyone to target their supply ships. Why would they? In their experience, enemies fought defensively, trying to protect their own worlds. No one had ever gone after the infrastructure that made Kryn conquests possible. Sophie transmitted the data back to Admiral Wells in a tight beam burst transmission, then powered down again to avoid detection. The information would take hours to reach the Admiral, but it would get there. Meanwhile, across 6 systems, the other human strike groups were beginning their operations. Strike Group Beta hit a fuel depot in the Outer Reach system. 8 human destroyers dropped out of FTL practically on top of the facility, their sudden appearance catching the Kryn garrison completely off guard. The facility was a massive orbital platform processing fuel from the system's gas giant. Destroying it would have been easy, but Commander Reyes had a better idea. Don't destroy it, corrupt it, he had told the strike group commander. Sabotage their quality control. Contaminate their fuel supplies. Make it so everything they pump out of that facility will damage ship engines. The human ships disabled the garrison vessels quickly, then deployed boarding teams. The Kryn defenders fought viciously, but human Marines had trained for close quarters combat in environments ranging from space stations to underground colonies. Sergeant Monica Okafor led her team through the facility's corridors, clearing section by section. The Kryn were larger than humans, their biology built for a high-gravity world, powerful and tough. But the Marines adapted, using their smaller size to maneuver in tight spaces, employing tactics the Kryn hadn't encountered. Flashbangs to disorient, breaching charges to create new routes, concentrated fire on joints and weak points in Kryn armor. Okafor's team reached the facility's processing center, and Reyes's sabotage plans were implemented. They introduced contaminants into the fuel supply that wouldn't be detected by standard quality checks, but would degrade engine performance over time. Ships fueling from this depot in the next few weeks would find their propulsion systems slowly failing. Strike Group Delta targeted a Kryn communication relay in the binary shadow system. The relay was a critical node in the Kryn command network, routing orders and intelligence across multiple sectors. Taking it down wouldn't blind the Kryn completely, but it would create delays and confusion. The attack was surgical. Human ships jumped in, launched missile swarms, and jumped out before the defending forces could react. The relay station was left a burning wreck. Its quantum entanglement arrays shattered, its backups destroyed. Suddenly, Kryn commanders across 3 sectors found themselves cut off from central command, forced to make decisions independently. Something their rigid command structure was poorly equipped to handle. Captain Ortega led Strike Group Alpha against a repair facility in the Iron Junction system. This facility serviced Kryn warships, providing maintenance and upgrades. It was heavily defended, surrounded by automated weapon platforms and protected by a dozen Kryn cruisers. Ortega knew a frontal assault would be costly. Instead, he used misdirection. Half his force approached openly, drawing the attention of the defense forces. The other half came in from a completely different vector, using the system's asteroid belt for cover. While the Kryn focused on the obvious threat, the hidden group struck at the facility's power generation systems. Without power, the defensive weapons went offline, the shields collapsed, and the facility became vulnerable. The Kryn cruisers rushed to defend, but they were out of position and confused. Ortega's ships engaged them at close range, the brutal knife fighting that human ships excelled at. 2 human destroyers were damaged, but 8 Kryn cruisers were disabled or destroyed, and the repair facility was reduced to debris. Across multiple systems, the pattern repeated. Human strike groups hit targets, caused damage, and vanished before Kryn reinforcements could arrive. The Kryn had built their logistics network assuming no one would dare attack it. They were learning how wrong that assumption was, but the humans were paying a price. Strike Group Echo was caught in a Kryn trap at the Darkside system. They had arrived to hit what intelligence suggested was a lightly defended ammunition depot, only to find it was bait. 30 Kryn ships had been waiting in stealth mode. The human ships fought their way out, but not before losing 2 frigates and taking heavy damage on 3 others. Back in the Helios cluster, Sophie was preparing to leave when something caught her attention. A Kryn command ship was receiving communications from multiple systems, messages coming in rapid succession. She couldn't decrypt the contents, but the volume of traffic suggested something was wrong. The Kryn were realizing they were under attack. The massive fleet began to move, their formation tightening, their alert status clearly elevated. But they were also splitting up. Sophie watched as squadrons began detaching from the main fleet, heading toward different systems. The Kryn were dispersing their forces to protect their infrastructure. Darwin, they're falling for it. They're splitting their fleet. Affirmative. If this trend continues, the force arriving at Andara will be significantly reduced. Sophie waited until the Kryn fleet was thoroughly disrupted, their ships heading in multiple directions, then fired up her engines and jumped to FTL. Her squadron had the data they needed, and it was time to get it back to Admiral Wells. When the human strike groups began arriving back at Andara over the next few days, they were battered but triumphant. Every group reported success, though some had paid heavily for it. The fleet had lost 7 ships total, dozens more were damaged, and casualty counts were climbing. But they had accomplished their mission. Admiral Wells reviewed the data Sophie had brought back, studied the reports from each strike group, and calculated the new situation. The Kryn response fleet would still outnumber them, but instead of 247 ships, it would be closer to 130. Still overwhelming odds, but not completely impossible. More importantly, the Kryn logistics network was in chaos. Ships that had been refueled from the contaminated depot were reporting engine problems. The communication blackout had created confusion in command chains. The repair facility's destruction meant damaged ships would have to travel much farther for service. Ortega studied the tactical plots. They're still coming. Probably angrier now than before. Wells nodded. Let them come. We've bloodied their nose, disrupted their plans, and proven they're not invincible. Now we finish this. How? We still can't win a direct battle against 130 ships. Then we don't fight a direct battle. We fight our battle on our terms. Prepare the fleet. We have 3 days before they arrive. Time to show the Kryn that humans don't just answer distress calls. We answer them decisively. The Kryn fleet arrived at Andara with ceremony and confidence. 132 warships dropped from FTL in a perfect formation, a wall of metal and firepower that had brought 14 civilizations to their knees. At the center of the formation was the command vessel, Eternal Dominion, flagship of Supreme Commander Throck, who had personally come to crush the upstart species that dared interfere in Kryn affairs. What Throck found confused him. The human fleet was there, but not in defensive positions around the Orvati stations. Instead, they were scattered throughout the system in small groups, their positions seemingly random and tactically questionable. It looked like the humans didn't understand basic military strategy. Throck broadcast his message with absolute certainty. Primitive species, you have caused disruption to the Kryn Empire. You have destroyed our facilities and killed our soldiers. For this, you will be made an example. Your civilization will be located and destroyed. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Resist, and you will know suffering. Admiral Wells's response was simple. We gave you a chance to leave. You chose to come back. Let me show you why that was a mistake. The human ships exploded into action, but not in any pattern the Kryn recognized. Instead of forming battle lines, they accelerated in seemingly random directions, forcing the Kryn fleet to choose targets. The Kryn formation began to stretch as different squadrons chased different human groups. The perfect wall of ships started to fragment. This was exactly what Wells wanted. The human groups were bait, leading Kryn ships into carefully planned positions. As the Kryn pursued, they found themselves facing crossfire from other human groups, or suddenly surrounded by Orvati stations whose weapons were far more effective against isolated targets than against massed fleets. Sophie's fighter squadron was everywhere at once. They had identified the Kryn command ships from her reconnaissance data, and now they were systematically targeting the vessels coordinating the fleet. Small, fast, and impossible to track effectively, the fighters dove through Kryn formations, launching missiles at communication arrays and sensor systems. Every command ship they damaged made the Kryn fleet a little less coordinated, a little more confused. Captain Ortega led a daring assault against one of the Kryn dreadnoughts that had split from the main formation. His destroyer group engaged at close range, using the massive ship's own bulk to shield themselves from supporting fire. The dreadnought was powerful, but it had been built to destroy other warships in formal engagements, not to deal with smaller ships practically hugging its hull. The Defiant took tremendous damage, hull plates peeling away under Kryn fire, but Ortega kept them in position. His railguns pounded the same section of enemy armor over and over, punching deeper with each shot. When the enemy hull finally breached, the Defiant launched its entire remaining missile payload directly into the opening. The dreadnought's internal explosions tore it apart from within. Commander Reyes had another surprise for the Kryn. The fuel contamination his team had introduced weeks ago was now showing effects. Multiple Kryn ships in the assault fleet had refueled from the corrupted depot. Their engines began failing at critical moments, ships losing power in the middle of maneuvers, becoming easy targets for human weapons. The Kryn couldn't understand why their ships were malfunctioning, adding to their confusion. But the Kryn were far from defeated. Supreme Commander Throck recognized that his fleet was being manipulated and ordered a full withdrawal to reform at the system's edge. His ships began pulling back, fighting defensively as they retreated. It was a sound tactical decision that would have worked against any conventional enemy. Admiral Wells had anticipated this. As the Kryn ships withdrew, they found their path blocked. The human fleet hadn't been scattering randomly. They had been positioning themselves to control the system's FTL jump points. The Kryn fleet was trapped, unable to escape without fighting through human positions. Throck faced a choice: continue retreating into a prepared ambush, or turn and fight a chaotic close-range battle. He chose aggression, ordering his fleet to turn and engage the humans directly. The Kryn ships wheeled about, abandoning their careful formations for an all-out assault. The battle that followed was unlike anything either side had experienced. Ships fought at ranges measured in kilometers rather than the thousands of kilometers typical of space warfare. Human and Kryn vessels collided, weapons firing at point-blank range, fighters and missiles filling the space between larger ships. The carefully planned strategies dissolved into savage close combat. The human carrier CNS Valiant took a direct hit to its reactor and exploded, taking 800 souls and most of Sophie's fellow fighter pilots. The destroyers CNS Thunder and CNS Relentless were caught in a crossfire and torn apart. The Kryn were losing ships too, their larger vessels proving vulnerable to human weapons at close range. But the exchange rate was brutal. Sergeant Okafor led a boarding assault on a crippled Kryn cruiser, fighting through corridors against desperate defenders. Her objective was the ship's intelligence core, data that might reveal Kryn's strategic plans. The Marines fought room by room, inch by inch, until Okafor personally extracted the data core and transmitted its contents back to the fleet. That data revealed something critical. The Kryn command structure was even more rigid than humans had realized. Supreme Commander Throck controlled everything through direct orders. Individual ship commanders were trained to await instructions, not to think independently. If Throck was removed from the battle, the entire fleet would likely falter. Wells saw the opportunity and made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed in any other circumstance. All ships converge on the Eternal Dominion. We're taking out their command ship. Ortega protested immediately. Admiral, that will expose us to fire from their entire fleet. We'll lose half our ships. We're losing them anyway at this rate. If we cut off their head, the body dies. Execute the order. The human fleet, what remained of it, charged directly at the Kryn flagship. It was suicide tactics, the kind of desperate gamble that only worked in stories. 23 human ships against more than 80 Kryn vessels, with the most heavily armored and armed Kryn ship at the center. The humans paid for every kilometer in blood and steel. The frigate CNS Dauntless was obliterated by concentrated fire. The destroyer CNS Falcon lost its entire forward section, but kept firing with its remaining weapons. Sophie's fighter, one of only 7 remaining from her squadron, flew directly into the Eternal Dominion's point defense fire, Darwin calculating impossibly narrow windows of survival. The Defiant led the charge, Ortega pushing his battered ship beyond its limits. The hull groaned, systems failed, but they kept accelerating toward the enemy flagship. The Kryn focused all their fire on the leading human ships, creating a wall of energy and projectiles that seemed impossible to survive. But the humans didn't need to survive long, only long enough. As the Defiant closed to within 1,000 kilometers, Ortega gave his final order. All hands abandon ship. This is the captain. Get to the escape pods now. Commander Reyes appeared on the bridge. Captain, the crew is evacuating, but someone needs to stay and pilot her in. I'm aware. Get to a pod, Luis. With respect, sir, you have an entire fleet to command. I only know how to keep engines running. Before Ortega could protest, Reyes locked him out of the helm controls. Tell my family I was fixing one last problem. Ortega had no time to argue. The evacuation alarm was blaring, and as captain, he was supposed to be the last one off. He grabbed Reyes by the shoulder. You're a damn fool, Luis. Takes one to know one, sir. Now go. Ortega made it to an escape pod as the Defiant's bridge emptied. Through the small viewport, he watched his ship, his home for 5 years, accelerate toward the Eternal Dominion with Commander Reyes alone at the helm. The Defiant was a dying vessel, already broken and burning. But Reyes kept her engines screaming, kept her flying true. The Kryn flagship saw the threat and tried to destroy the incoming destroyer. But it was too late, and they had concentrated too much firepower on the other human ships. The Defiant slammed into the Eternal Dominion at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, a new sun briefly born in orbit. Supreme Commander Throck died instantly, along with his entire command staff. The Eternal Dominion broke apart, its massive hull unable to withstand the kinetic impact. And across the Kryn fleet, something unprecedented happened. The ships stopped receiving orders. Kryn ship commanders, trained their entire careers to follow instructions, suddenly had no instructions to follow. Some tried to continue fighting. Others retreated. Many simply held position, waiting for orders that would never come. The coordinated assault dissolved into chaos, individual ships acting without coordination. The remaining human ships, supported by the Orvathi stations, pressed the advantage. They targeted confused Kryn vessels, disabled them, forced them to withdraw. Sophie, flying on fumes and damaged systems, made 3 more attack runs before Darwin informed her that their fighter had too much damage to continue. She reluctantly returned to the nearest carrier. The battle lasted another 2 hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Kryn fleet, leaderless and confused, began to retreat in disorder. Some ships stayed to fight and were destroyed. Others fled to FTL as soon as they could. By the time the last Kryn vessel jumped away, more than 60 of their ships had been destroyed or captured. The human fleet had paid an enormous price. Of the 44 ships that entered the battle, only 19 remained operational. The casualty counts were staggering. More than 4,000 dead, another 2,000 wounded. But they had won. The Orvathi were saved. The Kryn Empire had been dealt a blow they wouldn't recover from easily. In the weeks that followed, as human and Orvathi worked together to rebuild, Dr. Amira Hassan sent a message back to Earth. It was a simple transmission, but it changed everything. First contact made. Alliance formed. We have become protectors. The message spread across human space, and with it came the realization that humanity had stepped onto a much larger stage. Other species had been monitoring the Andara system, watching the battle. They had seen a young species travel across the stars to answer a distress call, fight against overwhelming odds, and win through creativity and sacrifice. 3 months later, Earth began receiving messages from other civilizations. Some seeking alliance, others seeking trade, many asking if humanity would consider helping them with their own problems. The Kryn Empire had terrorized this region of space for decades. Now someone had proven they could be beaten. Admiral Wells, promoted to Supreme Commander of the newly formed Coalition Defense Fleet, stood in the council chamber on Earth as representatives from 5 different species discussed forming a mutual defense alliance. The Orvathi were there, of course, but also the Halen from the Crystal Worlds, the Moros Collective, and others who had lived in fear of the Kryn. Curator Silth spoke to the assembly. We sent a distress call into the void hoping for a miracle. The humans gave us one. They came not because they had to, Not because we could offer them anything in return, but simply because we asked for help. That is the foundation upon which we should build our alliance. Not fear of common enemies, but the commitment to answer when others call for aid. The Coalition of Free Worlds was established that day, with humanity at its center, not because they were the strongest or most advanced, but because they had proven they would show up when needed. The Kryn Empire still existed, weakened but dangerous. There would be more battles, more conflicts, more distress calls. But now, when someone sent an SOS into the darkness of space, they knew someone would answer. And when that answer came, it might just arrive in ships marked with the insignia of Earth, crewed by humans who had decided that being a protector of the weak was worth any price. Sophie Grant, now a wing commander, looked at the stars from the new carrier CNS Defiant, named in honor of the ship and commander who had sacrificed everything. Darwin asked her what she was thinking. "I'm thinking about all the other civilizations out there, the ones who might be sending distress calls right now. I'm thinking we'd better build more ships, train more crews. Because we made a promise when we answered the Orvathi call. We promised to show up, and humans keep their promises. The stars held countless worlds, countless civilizations, countless stories yet to unfold, and somewhere out there someone was sending a distress call into the void, hoping for a miracle. On Earth, receivers were already picking up the signal, and humanity was preparing to answer